Hi, good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for coming here tonight. Definitely more folks than I expected to see, so I'm really glad that there's some interest in the budget process, and very happy to see everybody here tonight. Some of you folks were here before I came in. At the table there in the front, it's got the green tablecloth on it, there are some index cards and pens. So if you have questions during the presentation, go ahead and write them down and submit them. And I've got a short PowerPoint. Once that's over, we'll pull those up and answer as many as times permit. This is intended to be a Citizens Academy, and it's one of several, I believe, that are being planned throughout the coming months. This one, of course, is about budget, and we have other ones that are going to discuss other topics that are always of interest to our residents. The idea is to provide all of you with sort of a high-level, 30,000-foot understanding of how we prepare the budget, why we do it the way we do it, what the requirements are, and so forth. It's an informational session. We're not going to be talking about any specific budget. We do have some of our commissioners here. We have Commissioner Nabik and Bradford and Mayor Masarczyk, as well as City Manager Shang. Even though they are here, this is not a commission workshop. It's not a commission meeting. There's not going to be a vote taken, no action taken this evening. It's just an informational session for folks to understand what the budget's about, how we go about preparing it. Again, there's index cards back there for questions, and we'll pick those up once the PowerPoint is done. And we'll answer as many questions as we can. I'm hoping everyone can hear me pretty much okay. I've got okay, all right. If not, just yell at me. That's fine. Okay. Okay, so, well, what I titled this was the B word, the dreaded B word, budget, understanding our city's budget. So why do we prepare a budget? Well, first of all, the state says we have to. There's rules called TRIM, and TRIM stands for Truth in Millage. This is our budget book for last year. As you can see, it's very short. It isn't, but there's a lot of information in here. And the TRIM rules are similarly lengthy. I was just looking at the TRIM handbook for local governments just before I came down here. It's about 250 pages. So if you are really interested in the entire TRIM process, or you just can't sleep one night, go ahead and download that and take a read. The budget also provides us with a plan for the upcoming year, just sort of like you might for your household. You think about what are you going to be taking in, what kind of a paycheck are you going to be getting, and then what are your expenses going to be. So we start planning right around now, even though the fiscal year doesn't begin until October 1st. And then the budget also helps ensure that our expenses don't exceed revenues. That's certainly the goal. We don't want to spend beyond our means. Budget is not a financial statement. It's generally presented on a cash basis. So we look at how much cash is going to come in, how much are we going to spend, what are we going to have left over at the end of the year, what are we going to spend the money on. We take all of that into consideration for every department in the city as part of preparing this document that eventually becomes the official budget. And we have the budget book, but that's not the same as a financial statement. Every year after the fiscal year is ended, we do prepare an actual comprehensive annual financial report that gets audited. It's a little bit shorter. This is actually the CAFR versus the budget book, just to give you an idea. But we do present our budget, here's our plan, and here's what actually happened, if you want to think of it that way. The budget book is divided into sections. The first section is an overview, which has a lot of information about the city. It has the city manager's welcome letter. It has demographic and statistical information. Talks about Deltona's history and each division in the city. Also talks about our strategic plan. We do have a strategic plan that is reviewed frequently and submitted to the state as well. And also talks about the timeline. That timeline is specified in the trim rules that I was talking about earlier. So you have so many days to hold a public hearing, and then so many days in which you have to have the public hearing to vote on the final millage and then certify that millage to the property appraiser and tax collector.
You're doing good.
Okay?
There we go.
All right. Thanks. I'm blaming that one on you, Lee. And then we also have the actual summary and description of each type of fund. So why do we use funds? Why not just present one single budget for the City of Deltona? Well, in governmental accounting, we use funds to segregate different types of revenue based on the activities that those revenues are going to fund. So we present our financial statements on a fund basis, and we also present the budget on a fund basis, and each fund has a different tab and a different section in the budget book. So the first, it starts with the general fund, which is it seems to be the fund that just about everybody's most interested in, represents our day-to-day operations. All of our property taxes go to the general fund, and it's most of the regular day-to-day operations of the city: police, fire, public works, parks, administrative and support staff. One important exception, Deltona Water. Deltona Water is not part of the general fund. It gets its own special fund, and we'll talk about that in a second. After the general fund, we have the special revenue fund, and in there is where we account for certain types of revenues that are very restricted as to what they can be used for, and those would be things like grants or special assessments. Some other things on the list here are solid waste, stormwater, transportation, and any kind of special assessment districts. So we have street lighting districts. We also just formed, not too long ago, a Lake McGarrity Lake Restoration aquatic weed control special assessment district, and that's formed when a group of residents gets together and decides that there's a particular need in their community, and they will ask the city to form a special assessment district. The city determines how much it's going to cost to do whatever it is they need, such as street lighting, and we'll tack that assessment on with the property tax bill. We have capital projects. Capital is different from operating in that it represents things like building buildings, buying major pieces of equipment, major software implementations. It's not a capital asset is something that is not going to be used up over time. So this building is a capital asset, whereas pens, paper, things like that, those are not. So we have replacement equipment, or maybe parks. They're going to do some major improvements to parks. Those would be accounted for there. And so we have things like equipment replacement fund. We have the municipal complex fund, capital improvement projects, and once again, important exception is Deltona Water. Deltona Water is its own entity. Then finally, we have enterprise funds. Enterprise funds, by government accounting rules, are used to account for activities that are run similar to a business. Now, we're a government, we're not a business, but we do have Deltona Water, and they operate similar to a business in that they have customers, they assess fees that are intended to cover their costs and cover their operations, and all their activities, water and wastewater, is our city's only enterprise fund. A lot of cities have more than one enterprise fund. If they have, let's say, a marina or a golf course, that might be an enterprise fund as well. We don't have that, but we do have Deltona Water. And That's why Deltona Water's operations and capital needs are not included in any of the other funds. They all sit in the enterprise fund in our financial statements and in the budget. And as I said, we're a city. We're not a business. Deltona Water isn't a business, and we don't seek to make a profit, but we do charge fees to customers that are intended to cover day-to-day operations, our debt payments for the various capital improvements that have been made over the years, and capital improvements that are coming up. We know that certain projects need to be done, and we try to budget for those and cover those costs through the water charges that are assessed to our customers. In drafting a budget, we have some objectives in mind. These are our goals in just overall drafting the budget. First of all, we want to make sure that we have a pretty good basis for guessing how much revenue is coming in. I brought this magic 8-ball as sort of a joke. I told somebody who was coming in that this is what we use to build the budget. Don't worry, it's not. But we do try to get the best information available to determine how much revenue is coming in. So one of our largest sources of revenues is things like property taxes, and then we have state revenues and so forth. I'll talk about that in a second. But we try to get the most reliable and up-to-date information that gives us an idea of how much money is going to come in. And then we also look at expenses. We look at what we have for personnel and what kind of increases might be coming our way. Are any kind of laws changing? Are there going to be any unfunded mandates from the federal government, anything that we have to cover? So we want to make sure that we can cover that, live within our means. At the same time, we have to maintain service levels, so we can't just say, well, we don't have enough money, we'll just stop providing firefighters and police. I don't think that would go over very well, so we have to make sure that we can cover things like that. And again, we do consider major upcoming impacts. State laws are changing all the time. The legislature likes to throw curveballs at us every year. We also look at demographic trends. Are people moving into the Deltona? Are they moving out of Deltona? Are lots of houses being built? What kind of capital needs are coming up? Equipment eventually breaks down, needs to be replaced, or we may have to build a building for something, or improve parks, or do some other projects that the citizens or the commission have decided are important. And then we have strategic plan initiatives, and that's very similar to projects that citizens have asked about or the commission has decided are in the best interest of the city and its residents. We try to end every year with a surplus. And you might say, well, why not just spend everything? Well, we'll get to that in a little bit, why we don't just go and spend absolutely everything we collect and run with a deficit. We also try to build reserves, potentially, if there's something coming up that we want to save up for, or we might use reserves if we've got enough money built up for one of those objectives and it's time to start using them. Reserves are meant for specific purposes, rainy day funds, or maybe a particular capital project type fund or some kind of activity that's important. You don't want to dip into your reserves for day-to-day operations in the same way that if you have a savings account, hopefully you're not dipping into that every month to pay the electricity bill or buy groceries, hopefully. So I think everybody's still awake, so I'm very happy for that. Yes, Bob really likes, this is Bob Klinger, our finance director, and he particularly requested this slide. We saw it in another conference, and he liked it. And it's it is budgeting. I understand this is not the sexiest topic in the world, so. Numbers are sexy? Okay. All right, so going back to the objectives, how do we estimate revenues? Well, First, we have to estimate property taxes, and a lot of that information comes from the property appraiser. And I'm going to go a little more in depth into property taxes in a moment because property taxes are so deeply interconnected to the budgeting process. We look at our special assessments. All of those are set by city ordinance, so those are things like stormwater or street lighting. We look at what the state is projecting that it's going to give us. Every year, the state holds something called the Revenue Estimating Conference, and actually, it was just within the last few days that they sent out their revenue projections for 2017-18 for some of the categories, things like gas taxes or state revenue sharing or sales taxes. There's a telecommunications service tax, municipal revenue sharing. There's a bunch of different state revenue sources that we get. And we can look at the history of what the state said we were going to get versus what we actually got, and we try to incorporate that into what our estimates are for what we will actually get from the state. We want to make sure we try to make our estimates fairly conservative. We don't want to be too conservative. We don't want to be too aggressive. If we could reliably use this, then we know exactly what we're going to get, but it doesn't work that way. So we have to take our best guess at what will actually happen. And then, of course, we have local revenues that come in, and we keep records of what we've received in all of those different categories of revenue for many years, and we try to look at averages and trends to get a good idea of what we can expect for the year coming up. So, as I said before, because property taxes are so interconnected with the budget process, I did want to take a few slides to talk specifically about property taxes. It's probably our largest source of revenue, and it's one that's obviously of a lot of concern to our residents. Property taxes are a formula. A lot of folks think millage means taxes. No, it's not necessarily. It's not that. There's actually several pieces that go into the calculation of your property tax bill. First, there's assessed property values, which are set by the property appraiser. The City of Deltona does not decide the assessed value of your property. The property appraiser does. And that assessed value is not the same as market value. So you may go online and see some house for sale in Deltona. The list price is $200,000 or something like that. So you look up the street address and you go over to the property appraiser's website and you see the assessed value is only $150,000. Assessed values are typically lower than market value, which the property appraiser calls a just value, but your taxes are based on the assessed value. The millage rate is set by the City Commission. This past year it was 7.95 mils, so that's another part of that equation. Then we have to take out any kind of exemptions you get. If you live in your own home, you probably get a homestead exemption. There are also exemptions for folks such as low-income seniors, military veterans, surviving spouses, or first responders. There are a number of exceptions that are specified in the law, and any one of those could lower your property tax bill as well. So we take your assessed property value, remove any exemptions that you have, that's your taxable value, and that, with the millage rate, determines your property tax bill. However, the millage rate can't go above 10 mils, so even if we were flat broke, the Commission could not set a millage rate of 11 mils. It's not allowed by law. And let's say we're in the boom years. Let's go back to 2004, 2005, when property values seemed like they would never stop going up, and trees are going to grow to the moon, and nobody's ever going to afford a house. Well, your property's assessed value can only go up so much, and that's another state law, Save Our Homes, and that prevents your property tax bill from jumping, I guess, too much in one particular year. So even in a time when property values are going crazy and really increasing and the market is just red hot, there's only so much that your property is assessed value, and therefore your property taxes can increase. 3%? Yeah.
3% per year maximum
Okay.
on residential property.
And in case you didn't hear that, Bob was saying the cap is 3% per year on residential property. We do, of course, assess property taxes on commercial property. The Save Our Homes applies to residential. A lot of times we might get a question from somebody say, well, why is my tax bill so huge? What's going on? Well, understand that when you get a tax bill, and this is an example of a real tax bill, I've removed the parcel number and the name that it belongs to, but there's a lot of items on there. There's various taxing authorities, and you notice you see Deltona there, but you also see school taxes, St. John's River Water Management District, Volusia Echo, Volusia Forever, and then, of course, Volusia County itself. The dollar figures on this slide are probably a little hard to see, but when I added that up, the total taxes are about $2,500, and of that, $1,700 of that is going to entities, taxing authorities other than Deltona. So, of course, school taxes are a big part of it. Those are your public schools, the county itself, the hospital authority. So it's not, when you get your property tax bill, understand that that full amount is not coming to Deltona. It's going to a lot of different places.
So about a third of that bill is Deltona.
Yeah, that would be about right. Oh. If we were to look at the average Deltona homeowner, we would just take homeowner residential property taxes and then divide that by residential parcels, and I'm giving a very simplistic equation here. But the average Deltona homeowner's property taxes for 2016-17 were only $361.70. Obviously, some people more than that if they had a home with a very high assessed value, or they could be lower if it was a lower assessed value. But $361.70 works out to $30.14 a month. So again, it's not as high as certainly as many of our neighbors. If we compare Deltona to many of our neighboring cities within Volusia County, we're usually the lowest or second lowest. I think DeBary is often the lowest, but we're pretty low as far as what we generate in property taxes. 1 mill would generate $2 million a year for the city, so 7.95 mills. If we were to cut that down by 1 mill, the city would experience $2 million less revenue. But if you divide that by parcels, that lowering of 1 millage would work out to about $45 reduction in the average homeowner's property tax bill. So there's quite a difference when you divide that out by homeowners, what 1 mill means to the city. Property taxes are one of many revenue sources. As I said earlier, we get state revenues, we get local revenues. If I look at property taxes as a percentage of total general fund expenditures, it's roughly 39%. And I actually looked at the last few years, and it was hovering right around 39% as a total of, or as a percentage of total general fund operating costs. So all of our salaries, police, fire, all of that. Property taxes only fund about 39% of that. The cost of public safety alone, police and fire combined, exceeds the amount of property tax revenues that we get. For the last 3 years, if I take property taxes as a percentage of public safety expenses, police and fire, it works out to roughly 70%. That is covered by property taxes. So the rest has to be made up from our other revenue sources, state revenue and so forth. So once we've estimated revenues, well, we look at expenditures. And of course, first we look at our mandatory and fixed expenses, just as you would look probably first at your mortgage payment or your car payment. We look at things like debt service payments. We look at contractual agreements. We have contracts with Volusia County Sheriff's Office to provide law enforcement services. We have a firefighters union contract. We have interlocal agreements with other governments, so we have to honor those agreements, and those are mandatory expenses. Debt service payments are also mandatory, so the different bond issues that we have to figure those in. Those have to be paid. And then any payroll taxes and benefit rates, we really don't have any control over that. It's been 7.65% of income has been FICA and Medicare for years and years and years, and every year the state government sets the FRS rates for pensions. Pension rates for the firefighters are set in their contract as well. So once we get past all that, then we go to the department level and we ask every department to submit a budget request. And they submit a fairly detailed request that talks about who they have on staff, if they want to add any positions. If they have any large increases over the prior year, they have to explain why. And any new and replacement equipment, they also have to justify those requests. And actually, the finance staff and the city manager sit down with every single department at least once and sometimes twice if there are a lot of questions that come up, to go over those detailed budget requests and find out why the department is asking for what they're asking for, if there are significant changes from what was being spent in the prior year, or if they need new positions. We also ask each department to estimate what kind of capital and equipment they're going to need for the next 5 years. So if they've got equipment that's aging and they know they're going to replace it, or they've got improvements to parks, for example, that they know need to be done, they will try to estimate that out over the next 5 years so that we can get an idea of what kind of capital needs we're going to have in that time period. We also charge each department for its share of IT, so information technology, computers, IT staff, servers. We do a pro rata share of that. Fleet charges, if any of our departments have vehicles, each of them get charged for the repair and maintenance of the different vehicles, and also replacement equipment depending on their usage in the prior years. And again, like I said, we sit down with every single department and the city manager, and that same level of detail will go to the commission as part of a workshop, and they get to look at it too and ask the same questions. So earlier I said we try to budget so that we end the year with a surplus. Surplus means that revenues exceed expenditures. Well, you might say, well, why? Why not just spend everything? Well, one reason is because the state says we have to maintain at least a certain level of fund balance. Fund balance being revenues over expenditures is a surplus, and every year if there's a fund balance, that surplus increases the fund balance. If we go beneath a certain level that is set by the state, then we'll be considered in a state of financial emergency. And we would probably get maybe a visit or a phone call or a love note from the governor or the auditor general saying, hey, what's going on, folks? And we might even have them come in and take over operations. That has happened in some cities in Florida if they have failed to maintain that minimum fund balance. So that's why we don't operate at a deficit every year. That's why we don't just spend everything we get. We don't try to shoot for zero. We try to shoot for a modest surplus. We also may reserve portions of our fund balance. And reserves are for specific purposes. For example, we might have reserves for capital projects. If we have a lot of park projects, for example, that might be an example of one type of reserve. Another would be we want to have reserves for debt service because we know debt service is coming, so we might as well set that money aside and know that it is committed to debt service. We also have reserves for rainy day, rainy day fund, things like hurricanes or law changes or unfunded mandates. We want to be ready for that. We don't want one thing to change and suddenly we're in a nosedive. So that's what we use reserves for. As part of the approval process, once that's all done and it's been reviewed by the city manager, it does go to the commission. They review it in a workshop. Trim laws also require that there are 2 public hearings, first for preliminary and tentative millage, and then to finalize the millage. And those being public hearings, that means that the public can comment on the budget as well as part of those meetings, and then finally the commission votes on what the millage will be for the coming year. Once that's approved, it gets certified to the property appraiser and tax collector, and they use that information to start preparing tax bills to go out to homeowners. And I think that's pretty much, that's pretty much it for as far as the process goes. Did you want to add something, or? Yeah. Yeah, sort of like the yawning lion. What did you get in the budget? A cure for insomnia. A lot of work does go into putting together the budget, and that's why it's such a lengthy document. We try to show for each department what their goals and objectives are, what their objectives were for the prior year, and how well they did at meeting those objectives, and then, of course, what are they requesting and why? So it looks like we've got at least one question. How does budget transfers work, and why do they exist? Is there an average amount of transfers that are considered average? Well, a budget transfer is intended to be, and I know Bob will jump in if I'm wrong, intended to be moving funds from one fund to another. It's not a loan. It's intended to be permanent. Why do they exist? Well, we might move money from general fund to capital projects, for example, if we realize that there's a project that needs to be completed and there isn't any budget in the capital projects fund for that. Okay, and Bob was going to take over at this point.
No, there's a couple of really easy examples. The best one would be impact fees. Let's say, for example, park impact fees. The accounting rules require that the collection of those fees go into a separate fund, and you'll see a fire impact fee fund, and then we have to, when a project comes up that those funds can be used for, we then transfer the money into the appropriate capital project fund. But they have to go into that initial fund first. Another example would be the replacement equipment fund, which basically boils down to cash funding of depreciation. So all the various city hall departments, they need new vehicles, they need new equipment, new computers, whatever the case may be. They're hit with a set charge each year in the budget, and that is transferred into this fund and in essence accumulated. And then the actual capital projects or the equipment vehicles are bought out of that fund. And then every once in a while, the commission may, for example, the general fund has got, I don't remember the amount of reserves, but it's, so let's say $9 million unrestricted. If the commission decides they want to, like, for example, put $1.5 million into park projects, that will require a transfer from general fund over to park projects. Those are the best examples I can think of. And in our system, we don't write a check for that. That's just a journal entry that moves money between funds. So anyway, that's the best I can think. The rest, those are the only ones I can think of that are routine. Yes. The rest will depend upon what the commission approves.
So, I mean, roughly an idea of budget transfers. Like if I was to call city to city and ask for their average amount of budget transfers, is there like a typical average, maybe over like a 5-year reference?
Well,
I'm thinking probably would not. I think it would be all over the place.
Yeah.
That would be my guess.
Typically, if I understand what you just explained in the budget, you should try to foresee, well, that money should already be there.
Yes.
So if one pops up that wasn't foreseen, you would transfer it out of there, but not every project, right? Because most projects should already be funded when you do the project, correct? Like you're thinking ahead, you're saying, okay, we're looking at doing this.
Once the commission approves a given project, that's not going to happen if the funding is not already in place, be it grants, be it whatever.
So based on your examples of what would be needed for transfers, I mean, more than like 50s would seem a little bit high. If I'm taking your examples,
More than what?
50 budget transfers within it.
Well, wait a minute. Okay, we're mixing apples and oranges here. What I see where you're talking about changes to that's not a transfer. That's not an interfund transfer. That's just a change in the budget.
Moving funds from one area.
Well, let's say in a given department, moving it from office supplies down to electric. That's not a.
Moving it from here to this section.
So you're talking from fund to fund, not within a fund.
Not within a department.
Moving money between funds is not common at all. Not here or anywhere else. The interfund transfers that are frequent and do happen on a regular basis would be the replacement equipment fund. That's $1.3 million every year for for a very long time. Just based on historical studies of how much capital we need each year. That's the cash funding of depreciation. Sadly, impact fees are usually very small. They don't amount to much at all. These other adjustments, let's just say that a given department is short on funds and another department has an excess, then the commission can move money between those departments. But that's within the same fund.
Within the same fund.
The restriction in that example would be that the commission approves it.
Do all transfers go before the commission? If you have to go from fund to fund?
Oh, yes. Yes, absolutely. Yes.
And things like the replacement equipment fund, that's something that Deltona does. I could not give you a list of other municipalities that do that. That is one thing that we do. Not necessarily every municipality anticipates those kind of transfers and assesses those kind of fees in order to make sure that there are funds available for anticipated projects in the future. So when you ask if there's an average amount, whether it be an average number or dollar figure, I think if you were to survey every municipality in Florida, your answers would be all over the place. I don't think there's really like an industry average, if you will. And
See, for example, if we got a big grant and we put the revenue into the appropriate fund to begin with, well, then there's no need for a transfer.
Right, that's why my question popped up.
It just depends on how it works out. If let's say you don't have grant funding and the general fund is going to have to put the bill, then you will see a transfer. It depends on how that works out.
I think that was that the only card?
That's the only
Okay.
one I saw. I'm hoping we have more than one.
I did, coming through the slideshow, come up with a couple more.
Okay. Oh.
Before the budget goes to workshop, how long do the commissioners, they're kind of just notes, but you can kind of look through that. How long do the commissioners have access to review the drafted budget before it goes to workshop to discuss?
It went out. When did it go out? Late
Monday.
Saturday or Monday?
Monday.
I can't even remember.
Went out Monday.
Okay. Went out Monday. I'm sorry?
Next Monday is the workshop.
So it'll be
Now, and that's a workshop, so they're not going to be voting on millage. It's just going to be a discussion. Its actual public hearings are where the millage is actually voted on.
the other one on there was, where's the community center going to be funded? Under which fund? Because I noticed there was general, but then there was projects, and then there was parks. So
We initially had it in parks, but in the year coming up, it's going to be part of the general fund.
is there a reason for that change?
I'm sorry. What
From parks
I
to
missed that
general?
last part.
With the center at Deltona, we're putting it in the general fund instead of parks.
The debt service payments are coming out of the general
Yes.
fund. The annual operating costs are coming out of the general, and the annual revenues are going into general. The actual construction is what came out of the municipal complex fund. That's where the debt proceeds went. That's where CDBG grant funding has and will go. That's where the private donations went. Once the construction is done, I think in November, early December, that construction fund will terminate in effect, and it all becomes operating. But only the operating side of it is in general fund.
And I think the last question I jotted on there was the percentage, the 39%. If there's 2 million generated off of 1 mil, and we're a little less than 8, so that's about 16 coming in. That's still only covering 39%.
Yep.
Yeah, and actually, I ran some numbers on that.
Yeah. Total general fund revenue for 16-17 was $37,275,000, of
You mean
which
15.
$14,674,000 was property taxes.
Are you looking at budget? You're looking at your budgeted revenues.
I'm kind of crossing you up here a little bit.
Okay.
$2 million was calculated based on the valuation the property appraiser just gave us for this new year. So it'll be slightly different, but not a lot.
Yeah.
Want me to blow them out of here? Can everybody hear me okay? I'm a little nasally, but...
So knowing that, how long has it only covered roughly 39%?
Well, at
very
least the last
long
3
time.
fiscal years.
Is there anything that has been done to look into how to reduce us that only covering 39%? It seems like
No, that's actually normal, I believe. That's fairly typical. There are very significant revenue sources from revenue sharing, franchise fees, service taxes. Property is a small piece of the puzzle. But I don't think you'll find it's unusual at all. I'm sorry, Camille.
I think it's probably our single largest source of revenue.
Oh, yes, by far the single largest. Yes,
yeah.
Absolutely.
So it's 39% of total general fund operating costs. If I look at 15-16 actuals, we got $13.8 million roughly in property taxes and had $34.6 million in total operating expenses, of which 19.8 was public safety. That's police and fire. So it works out to about 69% of police and fire, or 39.7% of total operating costs. And that 39%, and I just took the last 3 years just for comparison, and that it has hovered right around that 39% mark for at least those last 3 years.
Is Lee back there?
There
Lee, can you put up that the PDF I did for property tax revenue generated by 1 mil? This is a slide I think you all might find somewhat enlightening, hopefully. And again, this is based on 16-17's actual information. Well, actually,
the 16 tax roll.
Yes. Now, what I've done here, let's make an assumption that the 8 cities on this slide adopted the millage as one. To keep it on an apples-to-apples basis. For every resident in the city of Deltona, would collect $21 in property tax. The land would collect $44. Now, this is all in 1 mill. No, okay. Or, well, I can read it off of this easier. And you can see the next city up to land is more than double what we are.
Yeah.
Port Orange would collect $45 per resident, Orange City $48, et cetera, all at 1 mil. Now, the single biggest driver for the demand for services, I would argue, is population. The greater the population, the more you need police, the more you need fire, the more you need parks. And I would also argue that the cost among those 8 cities is very comparable. We don't spend less on police and fire than anybody else does. This right here is why millage rates are not the right number to look at. That's the whole point behind this slide. Just look at between Deltona and DeLand would tell you right there that our millage would need to be double what DeLand is just to generate the same amount of property tax revenue per resident. Anyway, I've always found this interesting. That is the real world that we live in, unfortunately, and that's what the crash of 07 did to us, or 08. Yeah, we lost 62.2% of our value during that crash.
Yeah. Yeah, we actually had, between fiscal 2007, it took until 2015 to come back to that same level of property taxes, courtesy of the recession. So when they talk about the lost decade, we came pretty close to that. And I don't have a slide that talks about, employees for each of these municipalities, but we're usually lowest or second lowest.
Yeah, I'm going to see if I can
DeBerry's
Lee to
tiny,
put that
so
up, too.
they're,
I want to see, Lee, can you put the average tax per household up there too? And I'll just stay here because I can read it.
No, that was the other one.
Yeah, that doesn't look like the right one.
That was the one we just looked at. It's average. No, not that one. There you go.
This is based on the 2016 tax roll, which is for the 16-17 tax year. So you can see the lowest in the county, or the lowest among these 8 cities is DeBerry at $241.89 per household. We're at $361.70. Orange City's just slightly above us, so is Port Orange, and then you see a big jump after that. For as long as I can remember, Deltona has either been the bottom or next to the bottom on an average tax per household. That's all I have. More questions?
Yes, I didn't get a card. I'm sorry. Can you speak to, when you're looking at the budget history, you look at 14, 15, 15, 16, all the way through, and you see on those reports a difference between what was budgeted, what the actual was, why there are differences, and if there was like an internal threshold that if that difference goes above, say, 10%, that causes some trigger of what the heck happened here and why?
We do report on budget versus actual as part of our CAFR, the Comprehensive Annual Financial Report. For certain funds, accounting rules require certain funds report that, and other funds are not required to report that. Reasons for that would be, obviously our estimates of what we're going to get aren't perfect, so that would be one reason. We might have, and same with expenditures. Expenditures might turn out to be more or less. One example this year is we were expecting our health insurance costs to be greater than they have so far turned out to be. So that has been one variance from budget to actual. It could be grants. If we get additional grants, then we're going to have more revenue than what we expected. Those would be some examples. There's no threshold that would, unlike the financial emergency statute, where the state wants to takes particular interest if we fall below a certain amount. There's no trigger like that for budget versus actual. We're usually required to present original budget, then final budget, because we can amend the budget during the year, and then versus actual. And if there is a huge swing, yes, internally we will talk about why. Why did that happen? It doesn't trigger outside interference, but yes, we absolutely want to know what happened to those estimates, or why were our estimates off, or why did we go over, and we would look at that.
Let me throw a little something in here, too, because we've had kind of an interesting problem here for at least the last 10 or 12 years. These variances you're talking about have been, and it's become a little bit on the frustrating side for me, have all been favorable, meaning spending has always come in under budget and revenues have come in on or above budget. So we haven't had any of these adverse variances to deal with. The reason I say it's frustrating is because 4 years ago, the surpluses, to me, a reasonable surplus would be 2% of revenue, which is the better part of $1 million for us. But we were higher than that. And we would sit down every year with the city manager, and we'd go with each director, and they'd absolutely swear on their firstborn and everything else that they absolutely, positively needed what they had. They had cut every conceivable thing out, and then guess what? At the end of the year, they'd finish under budget. It was just frustrating, but every year that overage has gotten a little bit smaller, but it has always been favorable. That's kind of an interesting problem to have. But I would remind everybody that a 2% variance for us is $750,000. To come in $750,000 to the good is about where we want to be. As Camille mentioned, we always try to budget with at least a 2% surplus. And what I mean by that is we only want to spend 98 cents out of every dollar that comes in. We want the other 2 to be extra, to either A, add to reserves if everything goes fine, or B, save us if things don't go fine. We've been lucky up to this point.
Bob stole my line. I was going to say we spend 98 cents out of every dollar.
So the numbers can be a little scary because 3% or 2% is a pretty good sized number, and 3% is $1 million. So when general fund comes in $1 million under budget, that's only 3%.
You mentioned not all the funds fall under the CAFR. What does not fall under that?
No, all the funds are presented in the CAFR, but not all funds are required to present a schedule that says original budget, final budget, and actual.
Which ones do not? Or would it be easier to list which ones do?
No, it'd be easier to say which ones don't, because I don't for the life of me understand why this is the rule. The one that doesn't is Deltona Water. It completely baffles me. I have no idea. The one that more or less mimics a business is the one that doesn't produce it. But again, it's related to statutory compliance, I presume.
No, GASB. It's GASB.
Yeah, and I can't even begin to explain that one. But that's the only one that I can think of that doesn't present budget versus actual in the CAFR.
Do we have another? Sure.
Do you guys do any kind of like a budget performance review throughout the year?
Yes, we're always looking at actuals compared to budget to see if
It's usually internal. What we do is we continuously try to forecast how we think the year is going to come out. The first thing we look for is to make sure we're not going to have a problem. That's the first tripwire, so to speak. The minute we think there's any kind of a problem, we're going to be talking to the commission. But usually the rest of it's internal. And as I said, over the years, we've always come in with a surplus. I don't know if that answers or not, but the big thing to me isn't just budget versus actual, is to be able to forecast the year. I think it simplifies it to be able to go to the city manager, and I think we're going to end the year X amount of dollars over or under on revenue, X amount under on spending, whatever the case may be. Because governmental budgets can be very confusing, because you look at the reports, if you did it now, you might be looking at a statement that's got a 12-month budget but 8 months of actual. So if you don't understand what you're looking at, you can get some very inaccurate conclusions from looking at that report. So to me, it simplifies everything to go right to the bottom line and give them the big picture. So.
Yeah, as part of trying to develop the budget for this year, we have to start that process in April, May-ish, and we're nowhere near the end of the fiscal year. So we try to take actual to date and then project what it's going to be by the end of the year as well.
And this is a perfect illustration.
Yeah.
Health insurance, as Camille mentioned earlier. We changed providers. We really did not have any idea what to expect, but it is better safe than sorry. So we used a 10% increase. We won't know, for example, what the new premiums will be. I don't know when we will know, but I know it'll be after September. So we're being asked to predict this number, and by the time it's final, we still won't know what it actually will be.
Yeah.
How long do they give you a heads up of what your cost is going to be so that you can shop if it's not favorable?
Well,
Because my company wouldn't wait till September if we're going to change out in October.
well, I don't know what our contractual arrangements are. I'm not sure that we have the option to switch carriers at this point, but I don't know how many years we signed up for. But we renew every December, so they're on a calendar year basis. We're on a fiscal year.
Right.
So the timing isn't right. So when they do their annual review, it'll be probably January or I don't know, November, December, but it doesn't really matter because it's after we've published the budget. So we really have to go out on a limb.
Right.
And again, we got lucky. Last go around, we ended up with a big windfall.
Yeah, this year we all, again, forecasted or assumed a 10% increase. So hopefully they won't come back with a 20% increase. We certainly hope that doesn't happen. But
And remember, too, ultimately,
but that's an example. Yeah.
Don't lose sight of the don't lose sight of the fact also that at the end of the day, nothing matters but actual. I mean, there's still you still have to report on budget versus actual and explain why you didn't do it or did do it. But at the end of the day, the CAFR, the published audited financial statements, are what govern, and that will determine how much money actually goes back in the reserves. Regardless of what we thought was going to happen, what really happened is what will go into reserves.
Anybody else have any questions?
So, I don't know if this is right scope of this, but is there a goal for debt versus income? Because, I mean, you talked about you want to get 39% from property taxes, and we're spending, of course, way more than what we get in property taxes, and those grants and those other resources. But okay, I guess there's two questions. Do you know what our current debt service to revenue ratio is? How much are we paying in debt? And is there a standard in certain municipalities that they shouldn't go above this much in debt?
Well, I don't know if I have a real quick and easy answer to that question. Let me put it this way. All the debt that we have incurred, except for the $8 million that is for the community center, all of the other debt is what is in what is called revenue bonds, meaning that bond has its own dedicated revenue stream. In other words, it's not in the general fund. We don't have what's called general obligation debt. We have a debt in the stormwater fund to do some capital projects. That is paid by the stormwater special assessment. We have to maintain minimum debt coverage ratios. We shoot for, let's say, 1.25, 1.5. So the revenue's 1.25 to 1.5 times what the debt payments are. We have the same thing in Deltona Water. They have revenue bonds that are secured by user fees. Same deal. We have to maintain minimum debt coverage ratios. And then in the transportation fund, they are paid by gas tax revenue. Same deal. The bond, requires. In each case with these bonds, always require a minimum debt coverage ratio. Otherwise, we're in violation of the bond covenants. So it's going to vary a little bit, but it will be in the anywhere from 115% to 125%, and we shoot for 150%.
Right.
In the general fund side of it, the only debt that we have is for the community center, which is about $403,000, I think, per year coming up this go around.
Yeah, the total was about $8 million from the actual issue itself.
So that would represent about 1.1% of the budget. I can't tell you what the norms are, but I'll bet you that's well below the norm. We have been very, very cautious and adamant to avoid anything that is actually general obligation debt. We want a dedicated revenue source. The only exception to that, as I said, has been the community center, and if we have any degree of success with it, that may also be self-supporting. We don't know yet.
And they don't really tell us, but the rating agencies do see a lot of governments, so they know what other governments have as far as debt versus revenue, and that is certainly one of the factors that they use to review us when they give us our ratings. And we're rated in the A's from all the rating agencies, so they don't, at least don't see a problem with that. They don't see us as being too heavily leveraged. They definitely look at that.
But no more general fund. Yes, ma'am. You mean from the revenue side? What the budget incorporates, it's in 16-17. It's also in the budget that we are about to prepare. It gets back to what we initially do is we target a 2% surplus, as I mentioned, so we only want to spend 98 cents out of every dollar. We have put all of the operating expenses for the community center into the budget, and we don't count the revenue in measuring whether or not we've reached our 2%. So if no revenue materializes at all from the community center, we're still going to have a 2% surplus. That is, in effect, Plan B from the beginning was we can fund it without revenue if that's how it turns out. We're not, that revenue is not going to make us or break us.
Can you explain how we can come up with that versus how we didn't have that last year or a previous year?
What do you mean exactly?
The funds to run the center. Where was those funds these other years previous?
You will see, for every year I can remember, you will see a very substantial surplus in the general fund.
Be used out of the general fund surplus. It's not actually
Well, time out for a second. We didn't take it out of reserves. There's always been an annual revenues have exceeded expenses. And when we did the budget last year for 16-17, because I can remember Commissioner Honaker brought this up in one of the workshops, we put the entire $450,000 in the budget for estimated operating. We put all of the debt service in the budget, even though we knew that wasn't going to happen in that fiscal year, in order to put it in as a placeholder, so that we knew that when it hit in the following year, you were already at a millage you needed to be at to cover it.
Right, and I get that, but I'm saying, like, looking back at some of the previous meetings and things that I've reviewed online, when you're talking about the budget and what we can and can't do, there was even conversations about maybe having to change the millage rate and things to cover the budget expenses. So my question is if we couldn't do these extra projects or things due to budgeting and funding, we hear that all the time, certain things can't be done because of budgeting or because of funding. How did we just suddenly have this extra $450,000 or whatnot floating around to cover this if we bring in nothing? Like, where did that come from? Where did that other $450,000 go all these other times?
I wouldn't concur with the characterization that we suddenly had it. We've consistently had a surplus every year I can remember.
So the idea would be it would just bring down our surplus for the year. It wouldn't technically hurt us. It would just reduce our surplus.
Right, to a smaller surplus, but you've still got a surplus. And what we're aiming for and what we're saying this year and what we're going to present on the 10th is that if you took the revenue, when we put, I think it was $340,000 in for revenue, I think. If you take that revenue out and reduce the surplus, you're still going to be above 2%.
Yeah.
We're not going to count on that revenue in order to get us to the 2% benchmark with all of the expenses counted.
If you look year to year, are you saying that we had that much of a surplus these previous years that even taking a $450,000 hit, we're still going to be above?
Yeah, remember 2% is $750,000. In all those years, we've been well above 2%.
Is there a reason we didn't kind of give it back?
This is part of that frustration I mentioned before. You know, we go through this ritual. We'd sit down with these directors, and like I said, they'd swear on their firstborn, this is it, we got to have it. And I would tell Jane or somebody else, bet you $100 it doesn't work out. And sure enough, we'd come in under. Which, in a way, you hear a lot of this rhetoric about the government mindset, you know, use it or lose it. If that mindset were here, you wouldn't see those surpluses. But we do, because that's not how we do things. And we shut them down usually about 45 to 60 days before year end. We start to make it very difficult for people to put purchase orders through and things of that nature. But I've never seen anybody try to get away with that. Secondly, we have always been well above 2%. This is why we have, I think, what does it say in the last CAFR on the unrestricted reserves in the general fund? And I know you hear that. That's why we have that. That's where that came from. And that's where it came from.
The 2% is 2% of operating revenues. So we don't say we're going to take 2% out of fund balance. We say we're going to target 2% of operating revenues, and then we also plan for without the revenue. So it's not like, yeah, we'll just dip into reserves for that. We don't ever want to take that approach if we can.
But I guess my question is, if we did have this excess over 2% these other years, why were these other projects and needs of the city weren't complete? Like, why weren't they done with that extra money then? If it was already expected to be spent, why wasn't it put into, like, I don't know, fixing the potholes and stuff?
Well,
How can I diplomatically answer that one?
I mean, instead of just put it in the bank for a center 5 years later, I mean, why didn't it just go back into our city? If it was more than what we had already budgeted for it, and it came out extra, like, I just don't understand why it wasn't then re-spent within our city.
I don't know how to answer that. You'd have to ask the commission that question, because we still wrestle with that now. How are we going to spend the, did you see the reserve number?
which one did you want? Restricted?
The unrestricted?
Unassigned fund balance?
Yeah, I'm sorry, unassigned.
Unassigned fund balance, all governmental funds.
No, just general fund.
$26.2 million.
No, wait a minute. Let me see that for a second. I might not be asking the right question. 9.6 million. I don't know how we're going to spend that. That's what the commission's got to do over the next X number of months. But I will tell you, my opinion is, and I've said this publicly, we either need to spend that money on capital projects or we need to lower the millage. We need to do one or the other.
The number I
probably
gave you
shouldn't
was...
say that, but that's my opinion.
That was total fund balances, by the way, not unassigned.
That fund you're specifically talking to is I know you have to be careful with the transfers, is that it's unrestricted, right? It can go to anything.
Correct. That's not an accident. Well, like I said, we aim for these surpluses. We just have done better. But we have reached a point to where it's time to start doing some of these projects. I think Jane has all kinds of ideas. And
instead of new projects, like, well, I'm talking about, like, old stuff we've already been asking for all these years. Like,
Bob, I think you should clarify that has been an accumulation over a number of years.
correct.
yeah.
Grow from budget to budget.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Many years.
That's a 10 or 12-year number, but yeah.
But what I'm saying is, as you saw it grow and you had things coming up that were put aside because the funding wasn't there, but I mean, if you're looking at it growing every year, and I'm looking back at the tapes of when it was decided there was no money, I mean, technically, I'm looking at the other books and there is money. So why wasn't it then said, okay, you know what, you're right, because we are at $4 extra million, we could spend that, $200,000 to get this done, but we didn't. We just kept rolling it over until now it's 9.6. We got to figure out what to do with it. I mean, this doesn't make sense.
I don't know. I don't know how to answer that without getting myself in a position. I don't know the answer, other than you've got to get enough people to agree, number one, on what they're going to spend it on. And I think Jane has illustrated on a couple of occasions we've got enough unmet needs to spend that money 5 times over.
Absolutely.
So, but we need to do it. We're at that point. We need to do it. That's why you shouldn't be scared by that number. 9.6 sounds like a lot. It really isn't.
Yeah.
And the other issue is that the staff and the city commission is very conservative. It may sound like there's an extra $1 million, but we're only talking about a little more than 2%. A lot can happen.
But what he's saying, this is in addition to that, though, right? Like, we're still covered. That's not our every last dime we have.
That is free money. That's
free money.
Yeah.
It's not, oh no, this is the last payment we have.
What I'm also saying is that resulted over a number of years.
Absolutely.
And from year to year, we always try to make sure that we have a balanced budget. All right, that's what you want to do. You don't want to dip into your reserve to cover your normal operating expenses. Just like you have a budget. You want that what goes in is equal to what goes out. You never want to run at a deficit. And so you have to really compliment the commission and the staff here for being fiscally prudent. And so we were very good, and we are now, over a number of years, able to keep some surplus that we can now decide, in the future, what do we want to do with it. But that's not always the case. And there are many other municipalities who do not have a surplus or not very cautious, and they run into a deficit with their operating expenditures, and they start dipping in. What I'm saying is the staff is very good, and the commission is excellent in regard to watching, your tax dollars. And we are in a good position. There are some unmet needs, and we need to talk talk about how we address them. But at least we have some funding that's available that we can use, if that's the decision of the public and the commission.
And that's one of the reasons that we have the departments project out 5-year capital needs and 5-year equipment needs, because that gets presented to the commission for discussion and review to see if there's something here that really is really enough people agree that that's a big priority and we really need to commit some funds to doing that.
And that's a big part of the problem. It does take a consensus. None of this moves fast. I would say let your commissioners know and give them ideas. Jane just did a workshop on, I think it was Park CIP. There's going to be a follow-up on that. There's a lot to that. You've got a lot of possibilities in roads, I would say. There's plenty out there. But it takes a while for the commission and everybody to get through it, prioritize it, and agree on it, and then actually make it happen.
Which I totally get the agreeing part's probably going to be the hardest, but when it's things like common things that will always need to be done, like transportation has its own fund, and when that runs out of money, it runs out of money. So if we have this extra money that's just sitting there, I just didn't understand why I was like, well, you can't fix that road this year because the money's not there, but it is there. It's just sitting there.
Well,
it is there if you can.
When I'm looking at all these past meetings and all these past requests from the residents that were denied, and all the past budgets, and I'm looking and I'm seeing. But the basic, if we're talking about Beautify Deltona, I know everybody thinks it's the yards you see first. Swear to God, it's the roads. I'll swear to it all day long. When I drive through any city, the first thing I'm seeing is your roadways, and ours are sad.
yeah.
Yeah, I give them ideas. I'm sure they would love.
I've been clocking this one pothole by my house. Well, because it almost hooked me.
Did you say clocking?
I'm watching it. See how long it takes to fix it? Because I'm going to tell you what, it's been driven by at least 6 times by a city vehicle. Has to be. Because you got to come check my water meter. It's still sitting there. It almost put me off my bike the other day.
Wow.
It's still sitting there. And I know the commissioner lives in my area. I know that water comes by. I know code enforcement has its route out here. It's a main road. How can nobody else see it or report it?
Is it a county road or a city road?
Yeah, I would assume it's a city road. It's Cortland.
Anybody know of course? I don't know if it is or it's ours. Okay. I'm going to have to sort of disclaim on that one.
It's kind of where just some of the things, like it's frustrating to constantly see. I've been living here a long time, and it's frustrating to see these little tiny things that, they're expensive projects, but when the money's just, it's unrestricted and it's just sitting there. Why hasn't that been fixed?
Well, but remember, it's really only there if you can get enough of the commission to agree that that's a high enough priority, because there are more projects than there is money.
If we added everything together on those 5-year plans, it would outstrip 9.6 in no time. So obviously we can't do it all. And so that's the other flip side of that. Be careful to, just say, well, they're all important. Let's do everything. That'd be nice, but we can't afford that either.
That's why you need to get involved and stay involved, because squeaky wheel.
The rest of the time I'm here, you're so lucky.
Well, I'm only going to be here for a little under 6 months, so Lord willing, and the creek don't rise. But other than that, it's got to be more.
Got to be more of it.
That's why I put the slide in on the, she put the slide in on the lion. That pretty much sums it up.
Any further questions from anyone? Okay. Well, again, I thank you so much for coming out and giving us your time tonight. Appreciate it. Thank you so much.